Daddy's Little Owner. Chapter 10. Fostering and Children's Homes. Dad always seemed to be battling against his depression. He would say it was because Mum had broken his heart by leaving, but he was already making suicide attempts before she finally went. When he was drunk, he would often say he was going to kill himself, which made Terry and me constantly frightened that he would carry out his threats, and we would come home from school one day to find him lying dead on the floor. Over the years, however, we heard him say it so frequently that we began to take less notice, until one day when I was 9, he came into the house with a bottle of weed killer and announced that he was planning to kill himself with it that afternoon. Apparently, he'd read a story in the News of the World about a bloke who had done exactly that, and now he planned to take his own life the same way. He flamboyantly opened the bottle and drank it down in front of us. Neither of us had the nerve to try and stop him. He said goodbye and went upstairs to die. "Don't phone anybody," was his last instruction as he left the room. Terry and I sat staring at each other in shock. There was a part of me that was thinking, "Don't do anything. Just let him go. Your life would be so much easier without him." But another part of me couldn't do that. Whatever he was like, he was still our father, and he was still the only relative we really had left in the world who cared anything for us at all. But did we have the nerve to disobey his direct instruction not to call anyone? Dad was always telling us never to talk to anyone about anything private that happened in our family. He would warn that they would think he couldn't cope with bringing us up, and they would send us away to children's homes. If that happened, he said, we might never see him again. Sometimes we had to go into children's homes anyway, because he would get caught for something and sent to prison, and I would be desperate each time in case they refused to let us go back to him. If he killed himself, the authorities would have no option but to farm us out to whoever they chose, and there would be no going back, and no one left who would give a damn what happened to us. We would be orphans. After a few moments of waiting, our nerve broke. We decided we were going to have to risk disobeying his orders, and we rang the doctor. We explained breathlessly what had happened, and a few minutes later there was someone knocking on the door. When we let him in, the doctor went straight upstairs to give Dad an injection, and the next thing we knew, Dad was leaning out of the bedroom window, throwing up, his vomit cascading past the front room window below. The doctor then came back downstairs. "You'll be all right now," he said, as he left us on our own again. The only sounds in the house once the front door had slammed shut were the moans and retching noises coming from the bedroom. Looking back, I wonder what it was that Dad had drunk. If it really had been weed killer, surely it would have burned his throat as he drank it and caused him to collapse on the spot in agony. Had he substituted something else in the bottle? Was that why the doctor didn't have him go into hospital? I've got no way of finding out now. That was the last we heard of the incident. The social service department did not check that we were all right or talk to us about what had happened. The good thing was that Dad never got angry with us for disobeying him and making that phone call, so I guess that was what he wanted us to do all along. My feelings and fears after that incident were even more mixed up and confusing. Now I felt I had to work harder to make Dad happy so he wouldn't attempt to kill himself again. I had to try to help him mend his broken heart. But at the same time, I hated the way he treated us. I was exhausted from always being afraid and always feeling guilty. The social workers who did come to see us from time to time continued trying to ask us questions, probably well aware that there was more going on in the family than I was letting on. And eventually, when I was about 10, I found the courage to emerge from my silence and confess that Dad regularly sent us out stealing whiskey, and that I didn't want to do it anymore. It has all become a bit of a haze in my memory, but when they found that out, they took us away from him and put us into a children's home called the Durdens, which, as usual, didn't seem to be nearly as bad as the pictures Dad had been conjuring up for us. In fact, in many ways it was quite nice. The staff did their best to be kind to us, and we were sent each day to a little school nearby, which I absolutely loved. They bought us new clothes, gave us clean socks, and underwear every day, so we didn't have to wear the same filthy rags all the time. And the food was a lot better than anything we would ever get at home. But despite all these things, I still wanted to be back eating egg and chips with Dad, the one person who I believed loved me. Dad had taken up with a new girlfriend called Kathy, who he brought in to visit us at the Durdens. I never worried when he had new girlfriends because I was confident I was so special to him, nothing would ever change his feelings towards me. I knew he was the only one who loved me, and that he would never abandon me unless he was forced to, because he had told me so many times. I understood that he needed a woman in his life, and I couldn't fill that space, and nor did I want to. On top of that, I wanted a new mum, and I knew Terry needed one too. Kathy was a lovely woman, dark and pretty with kind, smiley eyes. She was a genuine sweetheart with 2 children of her own, both slightly older than us, and she said what she wanted was for all of us to be living together as one big happy family. Dad had worked his magic on her, and she was as much in love with him as everyone else seemed to be. And he was promising that as soon as he and Kathy were sorted out, he would be getting Chris and Glenn home too. He was still such a hero to me. As far as I was concerned, it wasn't his fault he drank so much, it was Mum's. So the sooner he was able to meet someone and forget about her, the better. The moment I met Kathy, I really wanted to be a part of their family unit. I resolved to be a good little girl so she would never have a reason to leave us because of my behaviour the way that Mum had. I also knew that if Kathy was in the house, Dad would be less likely to interfere with me, trying to put his thing inside me all the time, and I would be able to go back to just being his daughter. I yearned for that. I'd had my long hair cut off for a few days before that visit to the Durdens, and Dad walked straight past, at first without recognising me, which really hurt my feelings. When he spotted me and realised what I'd done, he was furious, because he said he had always loved my hair. It was as if I had wilfully damaged one of his personal possessions by allowing them to cut it. Once he got over that, we started chatting quite normally, although Dad always seemed to be on his guard when there were other people with us. "Do you want to come home?" he asked, in a moment when the staff had gone out of the room to make a cup of tea. "Yeah," I nodded enthusiastically. "Well, tell them you lied about me sending you out to steal the whiskey," he said. So as usual, despite the fact that lying made me feel sick with apprehension and guilt, I did exactly what he told me. I confessed to the staff that I had made up the story about the shoplifting, even though I had already been in the home for months by that stage. They seemed to think that that changed everything, and they let Terry and me go home with Dad and Kathy there and then. I couldn't believe my luck as we walked out through the doors with all our possessions packed up. I was actually going to be a part of a proper home, and both Kathy and Dad wanted me to be there. I loved him more than ever. We were going to be a normal family at last. One huge advantage of having Kathy around the house was that Dad had to leave me alone sexually. It wasn't always sweetness and harmony, though. Sometimes she would stand up to his bullying ways, which meant they were often rowing and separating. And whenever that happened, it would go back to mentally, physically, and sexually abusing me again. He always had to have someone weaker than himself to pick on when his mood grew black. And he always had to have someone to relieve his sexual frustrations for him. I came to look on Kathy as my saviour, and hated it whenever they fell out, frightened she would leave him for good one day, and I would be at his mercy again, full time. Although we were a bit like one big family, Kathy was wise enough not to give up her house, even at the times when their relationship was going well. It wasn't far from ours, so it was always back and forth between the two, but it meant that Dad could never completely dominate her, because she had somewhere to escape to, something that Mum never had once she'd married him. Kathy adored Dad so much she actually did want to marry him and do the whole thing properly, but Dad held back from that final commitment for some reason. Maybe he thought that gave him at least some power over her, or maybe he really did think Mum had been the only wife for him. Either way, it was a mistake from his point of view, and it was Kathy's saving. Dad was still thieving and fighting, and soon he was taken back into prison again. Kathy wasn't able to have us to stay at her place with her kids to look after, so the authorities put us with a foster family called the Legates. They already had 6 boys living with them, and told me excitedly that they were looking forward to having a girl at last. When I got there, I was thrilled to find they had even prepared me a pink girl's bedroom, and I soon realised there was going to be a price to pay for being a different gender. The boys expected me to do far more than my share of the chores, just because I was a girl. I was soon feeling that I was really being picked on, just as I had in the foster home where they called me dummy. I felt they were sniggering and laughing at me behind my back all the time. Although, looking back now, I'm not sure if they were. One day I was clearing the table after a meal and I wiped a plate into the bin using my hand instead of a knife or fork. The other children laughed at me and called me names. To them it was probably good-natured teasing, but to me it was more evidence that I was inferior to everyone I came across. If you were in care, you were given a set amount of pocket money each week. I discovered that one of the boys in the family, who was younger than me, was being given more money. "Why's that?" I asked, puzzled. "Because I'm better than you," he replied casually, and I believed him, because I always believed that everyone was better than me. I remember feeling so devastated by that simple remark that night I prayed really hard, asking God to let me go back to my daddy. As soon as he came out of prison, Dad would phone whatever home I might be in, telling me to run away and go back to him, which I always did at first opportunity. None of the places they put me in ever felt as though they were my real home, so it always seemed like the right thing to do. Although I was frightened of Dad and hated the things he did to me, he was still my dad. And I still wanted to be with him. Every time I went back to him, I always hoped that this time things would be different. This time he would be kind to me and he would stop doing the things I hated so much. But leopards don't change their spots. It was like a game to him. He wanted to be able to show the social workers who were trying to do their best by me that all their efforts were feeble, besides the power he had over me himself. Whatever efforts they went to in order to get me to safety, he just had to snap his fingers and I would go running back to him. When Dad got caught doing something else, probably shoplifting, he was sent back to prison. No one could really explain to us what was happening. All Terry and I knew was that the social services took us back to the Durdens for another long stay. It's hard to remember exactly how long we were there because time is so deceptive when you're young, but it could have been nearly a year, and I got quite settled into the local school again. I was still convinced that I wasn't good enough for anything, just as Dad was always telling me. I remember the school used to have maths tests each week, and if I scored 9 out of 10, I would be eaten up inside with anger at myself for dropping 1 point, for not being perfect. Even if I got full marks, I would tell myself it was only because the teacher had made the test especially easy that week. I found it impossible to think that I could actually be good at anything, actually be worth anything to anyone. While I was in the Durdens, a few of the girls and I would play dressing up games and would hold beauty contests. If I won, I was convinced the others had let me because they felt sorry for me and believed that I would be devastated if I lost. It didn't matter what anyone said. I was certain I was fat and ugly and useless, having had it drilled into me for so many years. I was forever throwing myself onto my bed in fits of hysteria, although there would be no actual tears. Just a lot of shouting about how I loathed myself and how I wanted to end it all. If the staff heard me and asked me what was wrong, I would immediately clam up and say nothing. There was so much going on in my head at that time, so much that I wasn't unable to explain to myself, let alone anyone else. I'd never been able to express myself or communicate with anyone well anyway, whether they were family or not. Dad had never encouraged us to talk about ourselves or express any feelings. In fact, he couldn't have been less interested if he tried. I was desperate for attention, but completely unable to think of a way to let people know what I needed. It was like there was a glass wall between me and the rest of the world. I couldn't make myself heard through it, and the people on the other side who wanted to help me couldn't reach me. When a lad called Harry, who was a couple of years younger than me, had a real explosion of temper and smashed everything in his room at the Durdens, I watched with interest as the staff all rushed round taking notice of him, trying to find out what was behind the outburst and consoling him. Harry must have been feeling really upset to do that, I thought. Hang on a minute, I'm upset too. Harry's approach suddenly seemed like a good idea. If I had a real froth-out like Harry, maybe someone would take a bit of notice of me. I waited a couple of days to let things settle, and then did exactly what I'd seen him doing, smashing my room to pieces, but for some reason, I didn't seem to get the same sympathetic response as Harry. They must have known I'd done it on purpose because everyone was furious with me. But at least they knew that I was seriously upset about something. I was now getting a reputation for being difficult. A couple of times when I was a kid, probably when I was 11 or 12, the authorities sent me on riding holidays. I got to stay in dormitories at riding stables with other girls I'd never met before and who knew nothing about me. We were each designated a horse that we would look after and ride for the week. They were the happiest times of my entire childhood. I had never ridden before, but I took to it immediately, going on picnics, galloping along beaches and taking the horses swimming in the sea, which was the most wonderful feeling ever. I even won a rosette at the end of each week. I'd never won anything before in my life, and I thought I was going to burst with pride and excitement. The people at the stables treated me just like everyone else, as though I was as good as them. I remember falling in love with the first horse, a gentle grey called Shandy, just sitting in the stables talking to him, telling him how great he was and how much I loved him. The second time I had a stubborn little brown pony called Nero, but I fell in love all over again. I learnt so much in those weeks. Horses were the only things I ever learnt how to draw, and we used to have bonfires in the evening and sit around them in the dark eating baked potatoes, talking and laughing. I'd never experienced anything like it, despite being so happy on those holidays. I knew they weren't reality for me, and that at the end of the week I would be taken back to my old life. It never entered my head that I could actually have a life like the people who lived and worked at those stables. I wasn't good enough for that. I didn't deserve it. I could hardly understand how I got away with being allowed to even glimpse into such a wonderful world. I went on another group holiday to a big house where we were taught how to do various arts and crafts and outward bound activities like canoeing. I was good at that sort of thing, particularly the sport. At one home I became obsessed with tennis, playing it every moment I could manage to get a court. I was a strong swimmer too. The very nice woman who taught swimming wanted to put me up in the higher group, but I kept refusing. I liked being the best swimmer in the lower group, and I didn't want to become one of the least good in the upper group. It felt so nice to be one of the best at something. Dad never encouraged any of the things I was good at, tennis, swimming, or horse riding, and I was never allowed to go after school activities once I was back home with him again. I remember I had a bike at one stage and was very proud when I taught myself to ride it. And then I got home from school one day to find out that Dad had sold it. Maybe if I'd been allowed to gain confidence and realise that I wasn't as useless as I thought, I would have had more ability to stand up for myself later and to refuse to go out on the streets. But I really thought I was worthless. Dad had told me so, over and over again, so I reasoned that it had to be true.